At the start of 2022, any Ghanaian trying to trade for the greenback would have needed 6 cedis and 25 pesos. Now, 10 months later, the story has changed. After months of persistently high inflation and a credit squeeze that has seen the country all but frozen out of the international debt markets, the cedi has hit a new low. The currency of the world's second largest cocoa producer has lost 45.1% of its value this year and is now the world's worst performing currency on the 148 country-long Bloomberg Index. Ghana is battling debt, 20-year high inflation, a weak currency, and rising inequality. In August 2022, inflation increased to 33.9% from 9.7% the year before. Furthermore, these vulnerabilities have been exacerbated by the current Russia-Ukraine conflict and the COVID-19 pandemic. How did it get here? And what impact has this downward spiral had on the Ghanaian economy? And what can the country's policymakers do to turn the tide? Let's put these questions and more to Emmanuel Dakwa. He's a partner at CCAD Global, as well as an economist. Emmanuel, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with this. There has been a lot of back and forth as to why the cedi is in the position it's in now and at the level it is. There are conversations around whether it's the exchange rates, which is quite relative. But tell me, what do you think? In your estimation, is the cedi's depreciation a result of a dollar that's grown too strong? We've seen that around the world and how it's affected even some of the world's best currencies. Or is it the fact that the cedi has been weakening, or is it a combination of a number of factors?
It's a combination of factors. Let me start from the external side. The US Fed rate has been increased for some number of times now. So it means that a lot of investment is going to move from developing and emerging countries. So it's not only Ghana that is facing that challenge. But domestically, there are challenges we have not been able to resolve over the years, i.e., Ghana's economy is very import dependent, and we have not been able to diversify our exports as it's expected. And as I speak to you now, what is fueling the depreciation of the cedi is around de-investment, especially from foreign investors. And so once they are de-investing, they are requiring a lot of dollars to pull out of Ghana's economy, which is also culminating into the depreciation of the cedi. I would also not rule out the issue of speculation. That is also fueling the depreciation of the Ghana cedi, because Ghana has requested for a bailout from the IMF. Investors don't know what the outcome is going to be. At present, we are doing what we call the debt sustainability analysis. Investors are quite jittery on the outcome of debt sustainability analysis. There are rumors that there's possible going to be debt restructuring. So these and other reasons are fueling the level of speculation on the market and also culminating into the depreciation of the Ghanaian cedi as against the major trading currencies.
Okay, so we'll also get, of course, into the conversation about the debt restructuring as well. But for many of us, we need to understand what's the impact that this massive depreciation has had on the Ghanaian economy, especially as you mentioned that Ghana is a very import-dependent country, which means that imports coming into the country become that much more expensive. We spoke to the president of the Ghana Union of Traders Association last week because they locked their shops in order to protest around the depreciation as well as inflation. So what's been the impact for the average business in Ghana? What's been the impact for the Ghanaian?
The Ghanaian businessman or woman is losing capital by the day because of the depreciation of the currency. As you gave the introduction, beginning of the year, the cedi to a dollar was around 6.2. As I speak to you now, it's above 15 cedis. What it means is that businessmen need a lot of Ghana cedi to change their currency, to change their monies into dollars to trade and to import the goods that they are bringing into the economy. Also, because of the largely import-dependent nature, it means that imported inflation has been rising consistently. As I speak to you now, Ghana's inflation rate is around 37.2%. And the inflation coming from the imported inflation basket is also high, which means that prices of goods and services are also on an upward surge on the market. To the consumer, it means that the purchasing power has been reduced because prices of goods and services are going up on the market.
So you've mentioned this inflation, and let's quickly look at that right now, because the numbers and it's the rate of the number itself that's actually quite startling. So right now, August inflation numbers for Ghana came in at 33.9%. That's more than 3 times what it was during the same period in 2021. And we've seen not just the Ghana Central Bank, but also central banks around the world trying to work on this inflation, raising interest rates. So the MPC raised to 24.5%, which is above market forecast of 23%. And that brought borrowing costs to the highest since 2017. That's the 4th consecutive hike. And it doesn't mean we won't see another hike from the central bank in the following months of the year. But when you look at it having the desired impact on the CD and inflationary pressure, do you think there's been some success there?
A little for me. You have to interrogate what is culminating into Ghana's high inflation. And Ghana's inflation rate, for me, it is more of a cost push rather than a demand pull. Hence, if you look at the various baskets that the Ghana Statistical Service used to measure inflation, food inflation is very high. Transportation is very high. Electricity, water. These are all cost components, and that it is not for me as a result of a lot of money chasing fewer goods on the economy, but it's more of the high level of cost of production that is also culminating into inflation in Ghana. So Bank of Ghana has in resolving this inflation rate been raising monetary policy rates for consecutive times, but we have not seen the results as is expected. So it tells you that the diagnosis might be wrong. It is not more of a demand pool, but it's more of a cost pool. So what do you do about what is accounting for the cost of production so that you'll be able to drive down inflation, which will also affect the monetary policy rate and then the lending rate on the market?
So there have been a few things that policymakers have been trying. You did mention, of course, the issue around speculation. And in order to stop that same speculation that's triggered fluctuations in the value of the cedi, the Central Bank of Ghana has also been cracking down on the Forex black market. Do you think these crackdowns have been successful? Has it really been a crackdown in your estimation?
The crackdown, they should be able to continue with it, because what is happening now is that because the Bank of Ghana is not able to supply the volumes of dollars needed on the market, the forest bureaus and then the black market, they are supply, and there's a lot of speculative activities going down. And Ghana's laws are very clear on that. You don't have to engage in black markets. And so the Bank of Ghana should be consistent about this approach to crack down on the black market so that we'll be able to reduce the rate at which the cedi is depreciating as against the major trading currencies, especially the US dollar. That is on the regulation side. But also timely and effective communication is very critical in solving this crisis. We are in a crisis now. What is government doing from the monetary policy side, from the fiscal policy side, so that Ghanaians and then the investment community will have hope and trust that in the short to medium term, these are the measures that the Bank of Ghana or government has put in place to resolve the current challenges that we are facing. And so I think in as much as we resolve the regulation problem, effective and timely communication to be able to drive down the speculative activities that are going on around the Ghana cedi as against the US dollar and the other major trading currencies is very critical to solve the problem now.
All right, so let's look at something else that Ghana is trying to do. So Ghana says it plans to maintain a fixed currency exchange rate at the country's ports for the next 3 months to protect importers from the continuing depreciation of the cedi. So that means that the US dollar will be kept at the same level as the central bank's interbank rate at the country's ports. Do you think this will have the desired impact, at least for those 3 months? This is yet once again another step that policymakers and the Central Bank of Ghana have pushed forward as a way to help get a handle on the depreciation of the cedi.
Short-term measure, but it's needed now because of the rate of depreciation of the cedi. It's making businessmen quite jittery, and they're also losing capital. Hence, the Ministry of Trade and the Ministry of Finance had to come together and to peg, our exchange rate as against the dollar at the port. I think it is going to make some level of impact. But going forward, how do you solve the problem about the largely import-dependent nature of Ghana's economy? And that is a long-term solution that we should be able to take seriously. But in the short term, I think it's a step in the right direction because of the level of depreciation of the cedi as against the dollar, which is also fueling in the prices on the market. I think it's a step in the right direction.
So let's talk about more steps. What else can Ghana do? So the MPC has raised interest rates like we've seen across the continent, but is it the only option available? You mentioned that this could be a problem with the diagnosis of the issue. It's more of a cost pull. And when we talk to economists from different African economies, it seems that the economic tool of raising interest rates seems to no longer be having the desired effect, or it's being used wrongly. So what other options does Ghana currently have right now to address the falling of the cedi?
I will take it from this angle. It has to start from the fiscal side. What is fiscal authority doing about it? And as I mentioned to you, if you look at Ghana's inflation rate, largely food inflation is going up. And I read a report that says that Ghana's food inflation is one of the highest on the continent. So what can you do about food? And what is fueling food inflation is largely as a result of transportation costs. So what is government going to do about bringing foodstuffs from the farm gates to the market centers so that we reduce the price of transporting food to market centers? And I think that is very critical. Again, the exchange rates, as we have spoken about, the Ghana cedi has been depreciating about 45% to the US dollar since the beginning of the year. What is government doing to resolve that problem? Once that problem is resolved, then you'll be able to see that inflation, especially imported inflation, will come down. And we can also look at the long-term measure of import substitution industrialization. And I think there are certain things that Ghana has comparative advantage. Why do we import the volumes of rice we import? Why do we import the volumes of oil, the volumes of all the other things that we are importing in large quantities, whilst we have comparative advantage? And I think these are very critical steps that a country can take at this crucial moment to halt the depreciation of the cedi and also curb the inflation rate that is also going up. And lastly, I would say that radical solutions need to be professed to solve the problem. Why can't we ban importation of non-essential in this critical moment so that we'll be able to reduce the pressure that is on the Ghana cedis as against the dollar? And so I think these are radical measures that the Bank of Ghana and then the central government should be able to take in resolving the challenges that we face now.
All right, Emmanuel, before I let you go, let's touch on that IMF deal. So we know that Ghana has been engaging with the International Monetary Fund for up to $3 billion in loans over the course of 3 years. But something, of course, as you mentioned, a new assessment of the country's debt sustainability is also part of the engagement. And Ghana will need to take action to restructure its debt if the new review finds that the country's debt levels are unsustainable in order for it to be eligible for IMF assistance. Now, Ghana's total public debt as of June 2022 was $54.4 billion. That's about 78.3% of the country's GDP, and that's upwards from $32.3 billion, around 55% of the GDP in 2017. So we can see that that is just going like this. So how can this assistance possibly play into the situation with the cedi? If there is an agreement and the restructuring is something that must be done, how do you think it might impact the cedi, particularly going into next year?
It's a very difficult situation the government finds itself in. Looking at debt restructuring, there are external components of our debt, there is domestic components of our debt. Permit me to just go through the domestic debt and then the various investors. If you look at Ghana's domestic debt, institutional investors have about 26%, individuals and households about 13%, foreign investors 12.3%, pensions 7%, and then insurance 7.7%. Now, the big question is, should you do debt restructuring? Which of these sectors are you going to touch? And its impact on the economy. We should also realize that in Ghana had to do a banking sector cleanup in 2018. And so should you touch institutional investors, which includes the banks and other financial institutions, what is going to be the impact on their bottom line and going into the future liquidity and sustainability of this bank? Should you touch investors who are individuals and households? How is it going to impact the individuals and their budget? On the external component, because Ghana over the past decade has relied on external funding of its budget, i.e. raising Eurobonds almost every year for the past 5 years. What it means is that for Eurobonds, it is very difficult for you to renegotiate and to do debt restructuring because the investors are many. And government has also failed to, sign up to this debt restructuring initiative by the World Bank. So it's a very difficult thing to do. Should government come to this point of doing debt restructuring, whether at the external side or at the domestic side? That is why, for me, I believe that we should be able to do an in-depth analysis of where to touch. Should you do debt restructuring so that you don't also destroy the economy by doing debt restructuring, whether at the external side or at the domestic side?
So I know there's more to that conversation because the negotiations are on. So it's definitely one that we'll follow up with you as we hear more details. Emmanuel, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And as we watch things continue to play out in Ghana, as they're playing out around much of the continent, policymakers and governments are under increasing pressures to find ways to deal with inflation, as my guest has said, made up of food costs and transport for many people across the continent. The cost of living is skyrocketing, the pressures are on, and there are questions being asked. And hopefully we continue to give you answers to some of those questions about how the economies of Africa are faring.